I guess we'll just kind of jump right into the questions here. What is the number one thing people really need to know, I guess, while let's start with while they're on the water. What are some of those general safety things people should be keeping in mind while they're actually out on the water?
Yeah, that of course, obviously, that's a key question, and the primary number one thing that that I would say is that's something that everybody needs to always consider and take into account is life jackets. I think that to a large extent that's common sense, but I think in some cases, we all tend to get a little complacent at times, and technically, as far as the Alabama state regulations are concerned, the only, well, with the exception of water sports, the only age group that is absolutely required to wear a life jacket is going to be children under the age of 8 years old. Now, the federal guidelines are under 13, but for Alabama, it's under 8, and in that case, the Alabama regulations take precedence. Um, Now, the regulation in terms of life jackets in general is that any boat owner is required to have. I mean, the minimum number of life jackets that they are required to have is enough to adequately cover everybody that's going to be on the vessel at the time that they go out. So if you've got a family of four, uh, you know, two adults and two children, you're going to need four life jackets. And of course, it's important that they be the right kind and size. Obviously, an adult life jacket's not going to be, very suitable for a child. But more than just having the life jacket, wearing the life jacket is really what we want to stress. And a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, it just gets really hot out there, and nothing's going to happen. We're just going to be, in this little area of the river, or Gunnersville Lake or whatever, and I don't feel like I need to wear it all the time." Um, the problem with that is when it's lying on the deck of the boat, it's not really helping you. And unfortunately, the kinds of things that can happen often will happen very quickly and without warning. And so, it's one thing if if you had the unfortunate situation where somehow your boat sprang a leak, sorry, sprang a leak, and and begin to slowly sink. Okay, you would probably have time to put your life jacket on, but if you're traveling very fast, down the river, and I'll get to speed in a minute. But if you're traveling very fast and something happens, you either have to maneuver the boat very quickly to avoid an obstacle, or heaven forbid you actually do hit something. That happens so quickly that nobody's going to have time to reach down and grab a life jacket and put it on. So the slogan that actually is used by the Safe Boating Campaign is the one that I really like to use, and that is: the best life jacket is the one that you'll wear. Um,
Gotcha. Yeah, that was actually going to be one of the questions I asked, was just the importance of wearing the life jackets. I know that when people are out there, not everybody likes to have them on. Some people are just like, yeah, it's not that big of a deal. But like you said, stuff can happen so quickly to the point where you won't have time to put it on when you need it. So, I guess you would recommend having that life jacket on, even if you're not in the water, making sure that you're wearing it while you're on the boat, right?
Exactly. And and if I could, I don't want to get into a lot of boring statistics, but
No, please
there are
do.
a few things that I'd like to, just a few little highlights that I'd like to
Yeah.
make from a study that the Coast Guard did 2 years ago involving boating fatalities across the United States. And some of these figures were really telling. For example, 76% of the fatalities involved drowning. Uh, 87% were with people who were not wearing a life jacket.
Mm.
And actually 2/3 were actually good swimmers. So that's another fallacy that sometimes people will say, oh well, I'm a really good swimmer, so if I go in the water, I don't need a life jacket to stay afloat. There's lots of things that can happen if you inadvertently go into the water. And of course, not only do you have the fact that the river currents can be unpredictable, and might be unexpected. But then you have the case where if you were, again, without warning, if you were to wind up in the water, and and especially if the boat was traveling at speed, you could potentially be knocked unconscious just from hitting the water, or heaven forbid, actually hitting a piece of debris. That's again something that a lot of people don't think about, is the river has all kinds of stuff floating in it. It's when you talk about tree, like branches, and tree limbs and logs, and I've seen all kinds of things out there. And yeah, I mean, it's not like it's chock full of that stuff, but it's scattered around, and a lot of times you won't know it's there until you're right on top of it. And so if you were to accidentally hit something like that, then you're potentially injured or unconscious. And if you don't have a life jacket, chances are you're not going to stay on the surface. And we don't want that.
Right. And so, when we're thinking about other factors, that people should be, I guess, considering, especially as it relates to operating a boat, all of that stuff. And when I say that too, like Memorial Day is coming up, a lot of people are going to not only be out on the water, but people may be drinking, and you're out in the sun all day and they're not staying hydrated like they're supposed to. So how can all of that, kind of affect people's safety while out on the water like that?
Certainly, as you pointed out, alcohol consumption can really take a toll on you. I mean, even somebody who's not drinking any, and even if you're just drinking water, as you say, if you don't really drink enough, being out in the sun, and the heat and the humidity, especially in the middle of the summer, as we all know, those of us that live here, it can get pretty intense. And being under those conditions, you get dehydrated a lot faster. And when you get dehydrated, you're not going to think as clearly, and your reaction times are going to be less. And then if you compound that with alcohol consumption, it's just that much worse. So the person who is drinking on the boat, they are going to become impaired excuse me, a lot more quickly than they might if you're just sitting in a restaurant. And that's not, I think people don't always realize that you really can become impaired much more quickly. If you're used to having a beer or two in a restaurant, and it doesn't really affect you, it may very well when you're out on the water. And so I mean, a lot of people enjoy having a little beverage while they're out on the water. And if you're not the boat operator, I mean, I would just say use your own good judgment. But just like with automobiles, it's really no different. You need a designated driver. And so whoever is going to be operating the boat absolutely has got to avoid any alcohol consumption. And it's basically treated the same way as a DUI in a car. It's just as illegal on a boat. So it but the illegality aside, it really is just it's a safety issue. I mean, whether you're out there by yourself or whether your family or friends are with you, if you're operating the boat, you owe it to yourself and you owe it to them to make sure that they have a safe and fun time and that everybody gets back safely.
Right, exactly. And so another question I guess I have is as it relates to while people are out on the water, say that somebody either like jumps in the water or falls into the water and they don't have a life jacket on, right? And they don't know how to swim or they're flailing their arms. Should somebody else get in the water or did somebody need to throw a life jacket in? How does that work as it relates to somebody potentially drowning? You don't want to put yourself, in harm's way either while trying to help another person. So how do you go about that?
That's a very, very good question. And and I would definitely not advise anyone uh, to jump in after someone. And the reason I say that, I mean, I know that sounds a little callous, um, but depending on the situation, a person who is in the water who is not a good swimmer, they, excuse me, sorry,
No, you're fine.
a person who's in the water, in the water is not a very good swimmer. They will tend to panic, as you can imagine. And a person who's panicking can, if you swim out to try to rescue them, uh, you can wind up in peril as well. It's just an unfortunate reality of the way things can happen. So what we recommend and what boats, most boats are required to have in terms of their safety equipment is another type of, it's not a life jacket, but it's, all of the, life jackets and all these things are referred to as, personal flotation devices. And of course, there's different kinds. Well, one of the kinds is a throwable PFD. And that's typically going to be, you can get these things at any sporting goods store, just like where you would find a regular life jacket, you can get these throwables. And typically, what you're going to find is, it's just going to be like a square seat cushion with a couple of straps on it. And those are specifically designed for you to, and you want to have them out on the boat where, you don't want to have them stored away in a locker somewhere. You want to have your throwable PFD right where you can grab it at an instant's notice and throw it to the person. It's also a good idea if you have lines on board, rope, is to, if you have, especially something, like nylon, for example, believe that's, one of the ones that, that will tend to, the rope itself will tend to stay afloat. You can take, a rope and throw to the person as well, so that if they're, if they can grab the rope, they can pull themselves back in. If not, at least if you've thrown the, throwable PFD to them, they can grab a hold of that, and that will at least, if they're not wearing their own life jacket, that will at least, keep them on the surface. And then you just want to, try to maneuver your boat, back over, if you can't get a line to them. I mean, obviously really the safest thing to do is to, see if you can get them to catch a line, and then they don't even have to pull themselves. If they'll just hold onto the line, then of course you can pull them back to the boat. You have to be very careful if you try to maneuver the boat over to them. You just have to make sure that, like for example, if somebody fell in, you don't want to back your boat up because that's where the engine and the propeller is, and then you got a really serious problem. So you never want to do that. If you are going to maneuver your boat back to them, you're going to want to turn around and come at them, from the bow first, and of course, shut the engine off, when you're trying to get them on board. So, but yeah, that's again, it's a good thing to have in case somebody wasn't wearing a life jacket. But again, that person that's wearing the life jacket is going to be in a lot better situation than somebody who falls overboard without one.
Right. And so I know we've talked a lot about safety as it relates to being out on the water, but I guess I'll kind of back up here and ask about what people should be doing before they get out there.
Yeah, so there's several things that in this can occur at different different times or stages, before you actually get out on the water. Of course, one of the first things well before you get out on the water is to have a boating safety class. Now, when you get a boating license, you are required to take a course, and most people opt for, there's several different online courses available, and those are fine in terms of meeting the requirements for the license. Um, but you actually learn a lot more from taking an in-person boating class with an experienced instructor, and you have the opportunity to be able to ask questions. And having been through that myself, it's to me it was a lot more interesting than kind of paging through page after page of stuff in an online course. And I'm not knocking the online courses; they do serve a benefit. But we just feel that the in-person classes are much better, that you learn a lot more. And actually, even if you've been a boater for 10 or 15 years and you took your exam, and and that was kind of the situation with me personally. We had a boat about 20 years ago, and at the time I took an online class, and then we ended up selling the boat along the way, and then just recently we got another one. And when we joined the Coast Guard Auxiliary, they said, well, you need to take the in-person class. And so in going through that class again, I learned two things. Number one, the in-person class was a whole lot more interesting and informative. And two, I had forgotten a lot over that time period. So, it's not just for people who are just now getting their boating license. We encourage people periodically. I mean, it's not something you have to do every year, but if I mean, I'm not going to put a timetable on it, but if it's been a while since you've had a boating class, I'd encourage you to take another one. So anyway, that's one just kind of primary thing. But another thing, especially at the beginning of the season, before you really start getting out on the water, as a vessel owner, it's a great idea to have your boat inspected. And that's something that the Coast Guard Auxiliary and also the U.S. Power Squadrons also provide this service, that we can do free of charge for a boater. And the great thing is, and this is something a lot of people don't realize, that there is there's no penalty, no downside in having one of these inspections. It really is, for lack of a better way to put it, it's a confidential inspection where somebody from the auxiliary will come to where you and your boat are. We will go through the required items to see if your boat satisfies all of the items that are required by law. We also talk about some of the optional but highly recommended items. But at the end of the day, if there's anything in the required category that your boat did not meet the requirement, that's just between us and the boat owner. That information doesn't go anywhere else. So there's no fines, no penalties. There's nothing that a boat owner would need to be concerned about. So it's something that we try to encourage people to do. But again, I think a lot of times people may see us and think, oh well, if I don't pass, I'm going to get a ticket or whatever. And that's not the case. It's a way for the boat owner to have somebody assess the safety and readiness of their vessel without any consequences. Whereas if you don't do one of those and you get out on the water and you happen to get stopped by ALEA, if they find that you're deficient in some required equipment or what have you, that's when you're going to get the ticket. So we like to try to help people avoid that, and be safe, the minute they hit the water. Um, Another thing, and this would be something that every time you go out is a very, very good idea, is to file what we call a float plan. Now, that's a fancy way of saying just tell somebody what you're doing. you know, um, you can get fancy with it. Again, on the Coast Guard Auxiliary's website, there is a place where you can get a sample PDF of a float plan that has a lot of detailed information that you can enter. And then the idea is you don't submit it to, you don't give it to your marina, you don't give it to the Coast Guard, you give it to family and friends, somebody who knows you. Um, but you don't have to, if you don't want to go through all of that detail, just a simple email or a phone call or something, and call your sister and say, hey, we're going out on the river for the afternoon. We're going to be out there starting around 1 o'clock, and we expect to be back in around 6. And maybe give them an idea of where along the river you're going to be, so that if 6 o'clock rolls around and your sister hasn't heard from you, then efforts can be made to try to contact you. And if that fails, then it may be that somebody needs to go out and look for you. So it's always a good idea, rather than not having any information about where a boater might have been going, for that boater to actually file a float plan, again, with a trusted person, just so that they have some information to start with, if for some reason an effort needs to be made to come out and locate you.
Gotcha. And thank you for touching on that. That's definitely extremely helpful to have that kind of like that checklist and just remind people, to take some sort of, class if they can, before going out there every once in a while. Because as you mentioned, you may forget some things might have changed over the years. Is there anything that you would like to add that I didn't ask you about?
Just like on the highway, I'm going to use the same phrase that we've all heard before: speed kills. Now, everybody likes to get out on the water, and you think, okay, well, it's not like being on a road. You're not confined on the water. You can go any direction you want to go, and it's just wide open. Let's get out in the boat and just full throttle it. And it's an adrenaline rush, and it's fun. I would just say, people need to use some common sense, and be cautious, because you are not the only person out there. And as I just said, it's not like a road where you're confined to two-way traffic. You got people going in all different directions. And unfortunately, a lot of those folks are, or I won't say a lot, but there are some folks that may not be paying a lot of attention. And a classic case of this is somebody out having fun on a personal watercraft. They're going in all different directions and circles, and they're just having a great time, but they may not be watching who's around them. And I've seen plenty of cases where, somebody on a personal watercraft, either accidentally or sometimes on purpose, will dart in front of another boat, or in one way or another will get too close, to a boat. And so if you're going really, really fast and something suddenly happens where you've got an obstacle in front of you, whether it's another boater, whether it's a piece of debris in the water, or even one of the metal channel markers, the buoys that are out there, those things are big and metal, and you do not want to run into one of those. And they're usually pretty visible. Problem is, and this is one of the things that the auxiliary is tasked with doing, is to try to help keep an eye on the buoys in the river, and to make sure that they're where they're supposed to be, and that they are actually there, and that they are clearly visible. And we've had cases where there might not be, where sometimes a barge or something will come into contact with a buoy and will actually drag it out of position. So that can happen. But really, the concern that I have is, we've had a couple of cases where a buoy would become partially submerged, so it's not floating on top of the water as high as it normally would, and therefore the visibility is highly reduced. So you might not actually see that buoy until you're right on top of it. Um, and the faster you're going, the harder it is going to be for you to avoid it. So again, I would just mention speed. I don't want to beat that to death, but that people need to use some common sense and have fun, but you know try to do it safely, and again, just be mention your situational awareness. That's also very important. So as the boat operator, you need to be aware of everything that's going on around you. Get somebody, if you're not on the boat by yourself, get somebody to help you keep an eye out, either in front of you or behind you. That's something that in the auxiliary, we have people that are designated when we go out on a patrol, that to help to help the person driving the boat to be fully aware, because again, it's easy to potentially get focused on something or distracted in some way. And if you've got an extra pair of eyes looking, it's like, oh wait, we got a boat approaching, off to the side here. That might be something that the vessel operator might not be aware of. And so that can be a good thing as well to do. Everybody loves water sports, so it's important to point out that when you've got somebody who is going to be skiing, wakeboarding, tubing, whatever, those activities are great fun, but you need somebody on the boat to watch the person in the water, other than the boat operator. Now, in a pinch, the boat operator can use, if you've got a large wide angle mirror at the helm, where the boat operator can see the person in the water. You can certainly do it that way, but it works a whole lot better to have a designated person watching, to advise the boat operator if something happens. So somebody on the wakeboard lets go of the rope, or they happen to fall over or whatever. Then you want the boat operator to know that immediately. And so that's is something that is actually required by Alabama regulation, that you have somebody to watch the person participating in water sports. So just another item there.